Okay, it's like we're ready to go. Okay. All right, I'm ready now. All right, so I do want to answer some questions from last class. So we had what is the influence of postpartum depression on infanticide? And someone asked in that relationship, someone asked about psychotic breaks, those kinds of things dealing with mothers. And someone else asked the question about abortion and homicide. So we're going to kind of explain that tonight. So first of all, I want to say that postpartum depression, and just so you know, the technical term for a parent killing their child is filicide. That's FILICIDE. And so the relationship between postpartum depression and homicide of a child or filicide is a little bit complicated. And so I kind of want to go through it so that we all kind of understand it. So what has been published so far, and the first thing that I have to note is this type of homicide that is related to postpartum depression is very rare. We're talking, 0.0 with probably 15 more zeros and then a 1. It's the calculation is 1 in 50 to the 10th power. And so it's very rare, but it does happen. And the case in Texas kind of shows that. And there's several other cases that kind of show this kind of trend that can occur. Okay. So postpartum depression in and of itself, does it cause filicide, even at an extreme level? The answer is really no, or actually it's depends. Okay. Normally what we see with mothers is that if they have postpartum depression, which is more towards a moderate to severe end, and they have a history of mental health issues or mental illness issues, that is actually what puts an infant up at risk for homicide from their mother. And it's combined with what we call psychosis. And I just want to explain what psychosis is really quick. Psychosis is a severe mental condition. It is actually a diagnosable condition in which your thoughts and emotions are so affect the person, they become so overwhelming that the person loses contact from the real world. They basically go within themselves and they start living kind of an imaginary world, if you want to put it that way, to escape from the overwhelming emotions that they're having. And there's two kind of types of psychosis. There's organic psychosis and there's situational psychosis. Organic psychosis is when someone has a genetic propensity towards it. So this is an individual where their emotions and their genetic code for their emotions and affect and their temperament are so in such a way that it's an organic thing. The other type of organic psychosis is when there's some type of either severe trauma or some type of organic injury to the individual. So there's actual damage to areas of the brain that control emotional states and those kinds of things. Okay. So when it really comes to postpartum depression, we see that psychosis plays a role in it. So there has to be some history of psychosis or some history of severe trauma, such as a death to a mother at an early age, or some type of incest. Okay, so either one of those. So it's either a history of severe trauma or what we call situational psychosis. This is psychosis that is triggered by immediate situations that overwhelm the individual, and the postpartum depression kind of adds on to that, builds on to that. And then the second component is that there needs to be some type of severe mental illness before pregnancy, okay? And what this does is it makes it so that the individual will either commit infanticide or filicide based on two kind of dynamics. The first one is that they do it out of love and mercy for the child. They don't want to see the infant suffer. They don't want them to experience what the mother is going through. And so the mother will terminate the infant, if you want to use that statement. The other one is if they go through a severe acute psychosis. This is probably the example of that. This may be the example of the Texas example that was mentioned in class the other day. But this is where a person just goes through some severe type of acute state. And usually these are the ones that end up in a infant mother suicide, okay? And so this is that combined effect. And that one is actually even more rare than when a mother commits this out of love or mercy for their child, okay? And we'll actually see that one of the primary types of serial killers when it comes to females tends to be the ones of mercy, that they see someone suffering and they want to end that suffering in some way, okay? The second question is abortion considered murder? The answer to that is typically is that from a legal perspective, it is considered murder if it's not, if the abortion isn't completed according to the legal statute for that state or for that area. So, I think, a lot of states do the 16th week. So after the 16th week, if a woman has an abortion, that they consider homicide. And this as abortion as homicide actually has a very long history that we keep going back and forth on in societies. We can look clear back in Western societies to the Greeks, for example, and what's known as a Hippocratic oath. The Hippocratic oath is what all medical doctors, psychologists, and everything take that basically states to do no harm. Okay, and it for most people think that that's what it is. It's do no harm, but the hypocrisy who actually coined the term do no harm. He said, do no harm to a person and an unborn child. And so, and the reason why I bring this up is we can see even in the ancient times, they struggled with this question, because for the Greeks, this is the kind of counter thing. We don't actually even get our soul until we're born. The word psychology, for example, psyche, which is your psychic life and everything, which contains your soul and everything else, actually translates into Greek to breath or breathing. Because what the Greeks believed is that we breathe when we're born, our first breath, we breathe in our soul. And then when we die, we breathe out our soul. And so even though on one level with Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath, they're saying we should do no harm to an unborn child, the Greeks also denied personage to an unborn child until they're born and they breathe in their soul. So this whole idea of abortion being murder or not, this is a debate that we continue to go through in societies, and we're kind of in the United States, we're going through the conservative mode of politics, and so we'll see this debate continue. Now, with that being said, there is something that's called neonatal murder. Okay, this is when a mother purposely, for maladaptive reasons, terminates their pregnancy kind of on their own. And what I mean by that is they do it in two ways. Either they do it when the baby is unborn, so they'll take a knife and stab their stomach in order to, and usually we consider neonatal murder when it's happening in the third trimester. And the other type of neonatal murder is when a premature infant is born and they're in the NICU, the neo intensive care unit. And that's when you see the majority of neonatal murders. There's cases of, for example, Texas had a mother who went into the neonatal and threw her two infants against the wall because she, again, didn't want those infants to suffer in some way. So that's the issue. So there is something called neonatal murder, but on the abortion end, from a legal perspective, they tend to state that it's dependent upon the law that is established by the courts. Okay. Did I answer the questions that everyone asked real quick? Let me know in the chat if I got to the questions, or unmute yourself. Did I get the questions answered for Monday's class? Okay, thank you, Samuel. Okay, awesome. All right, so let's go on to psychopaths and serial killers. As I mentioned, not all psychopaths are serial killers, but from what we know, most all serial killers are psychopaths. And I'm going to try and do this in two ways. One, I want to explain what psychopathology is, and then what serial killing is, and how those combined with each other to create the condition that we see with this type of homicide. Okay. So when we talk about from at least a scientific or a psychological perspective, who can be considered evil? Okay, and we have basically, and when I say evil, I mean someone who completely has the intention to do harm to anyone that comes across to them. Okay. And there's basically about 4 tests or 4 criteria that someone would need to meet in order to be considered psychopathic in this sense, or purely evil. Okay. Test 1 is they would need to lack a theory of mind and mentalizing ability. I think I mentioned in here the mirror neuroning system, and this is what keeps us connected to each other, and theory of mind. And I kind of want to explain this for just a minute. Theory of mind is something that develops around 24 to 36 weeks of life. And again, there's a lot of variation in this. There's many who can do it below and after this period, but 24 to 36 is where the majority of individuals develop this notion of theory of mind. Okay. And theory of mind is basically this ability to recognize yourself and recognize that you have your own thoughts, emotions, and feelings. And therefore, other people have their own thoughts, feelings, and emotions that are separate from mine. The basic way to look at this is if you look at a 24-month-old or younger, they see mom crying, and so they'll cry too. They'll see mom happy, so unless they need a need taken care of, they tend to be happy and laugh along as well. But around 24 months, let's say the child is in a good mood and they notice mom crying, they will go and try and soothe her because they understand that they're in a different state that she's in. Okay. And this is the basis of theory of mind. And there's two kind of basic tests to test for theory of mind. One, we have to have a self-recognition test, and a test to see if the child recognizes that someone else had an experience different than theirs. So and I'm just going to give the very basic examples. There's several tests for both of these, but I'm going to give kind of the most basic of them. The first one is self-recognition. So before the child goes to sleep, we put a mirror in front of them, they look at themselves, and then they go for a nap. And then we put an odorless colored dye on their forehead, maybe red or blue or something like that. And then when we wake up, we put the mirror in front of them. And if they're able to recognize themselves in the mirror, they'll notice that there's something there that wasn't there before, and they'll try and rub it off or try and figure out what it is. Okay. There are what's interesting to this is there's many species that are unable to recognize the mirror test. We know that our closest genetic relatives, such as primates, dolphins, and elephants, are capable of this self-recognition in the mirror. But other animals we've tested, our dogs, our cats, other animals that have been tested tend not to be able to see this difference once they're awakened. So it's kind of a unique thing to our species and our closely genetic species. So that's the first. So that's the first kind of notion we have about self-recognition. The second test is to realize that other people have experiences that are not like ours. So in this instance, let's say we have two children at a table and we have two cups, okay? And we take a ball in front of both of the children and put the ball in one cup, let's say cup A, okay? And then one of the children leave the room. And in front of the remaining child, we take the ball out of cup A and put it into cup B. And then we ask that child, when the next child returns, which cup should the child look into? And the proper response is cup A, because that's the last time that child who left the room saw that ball. And we find that, again, children above the 24 to 36 month age tend to be able to do that task successfully. Children under that age tend to give their experience. Well, when that guy comes back, he should look in cup B, because that was kind of my experience. Okay. Now there's like 16 different tests for this. I'm just giving you the simplest example. But what we find is that psychopaths fail both of these tests for theory of mind. Okay, not only for the children that have been measured that then go into that, but even as adults, they fail these simple tasks of perspective taking and all this kind of things. Now, theory of mind, if you think about it, is the basis of empathy. It's what we need to experience what other people experience. So obviously, if you fail this one, you're probably going to fail this one. And empathy is kind of that mirror neuroning that we see, where we have that same experience that individual is going through. We feel their emotions, we feel their behavior, and we feel all of those things. That's a state of empathy. And what empathy allows us to do is to truly connect to other people. And again, when we look at psychopaths, they tend to lack empathy. The third thing is a lack of conscientiousness. Okay, conscientiousness meaning being concerned for others, being, it's kind of like if you're going on vacation, you make sure your office is organized and your house is clean and everything else, just in case someone else needs it. Person who lacks consciousness says, you know what, No one needs to know what my business and my desk, this is my stuff, my home. I can keep, and even if they're going on vacation or whatever they need to do, or having someone else do their work, that's a lack of conscientiousness. And we find again that psychopaths lack this ability to be concerned for others, even when they're not there. Okay. And then the fourth test is they would need to view others as objects rather than people. And if you can imagine, if you're going to fail these first three, you're going to probably fail the fourth one, because the inability to see someone else's humanness and experience with them sets you up to look at others as objects rather than humans, rather than people. Okay. And so these are the kind of the four tests, and we have a kind of a assessment that we can do that is called the Hare Psychopath checklist. Okay. And if you look here on the left, we have a list of 20 characteristics that tend to that psychopaths tend to have. So we have glibness, grandiose sense of self, constant need for stimulation, so that instant gratification, pathological lying, lack of remorse or guilt. And it's scored on a scale of 0 to 2. And I kind of want to explain this, because what's required because if you're like me, you've looked through this and you go, sometimes I'm not remorseful or forgetful, or sometimes I'm very impulsive and irresponsible. Am I a psychopath? The answer is probably not, because what's required to do this list is to do a full psychosocial history of the individual, meaning that you go clear back into early childhood and look at their life and their domains of life. Okay. In order, for example, to score high in impulsiveness, you'd need to be impulsive at work. You'd need to be impulsive at church. You need to be impulsive at home. You need to be impulsive with people. In other words, in order to score a 2, you have to be impulsive in all domains of life. Okay. And we can all, and this is why doing a full history on these individuals is important, because I'm sure there's areas of our life where we're irresponsible, but we're not irresponsible in all domains of our life. Okay. And so this is kind of how the Hare Psychopath checklist works. It started in 1991, and it's still the preferred method of well, I don't want to say diagnosing, because it's not actually considered a disorder, which I'll explain here in a minute. This is how we assess psychopathic tendencies. Okay. So pretty much, when we talk about, and I hope everybody is in this range, most non-criminal people score between 3 to 6, meaning there's going to be areas of any of these that we probably do in many of the domains of our life, or at least a few of them. Okay. When we talk about what's called non-psychopathic criminals, so this is a person who doesn't qualify for antisocial or psychopathic tendencies. These are individuals who in most domains of their life, they're normal, regular people, but then they have criminal tendencies in other parts of their life. Okay. So they score between about 16 to 22. Okay. When we're talking about antisocial personality disorder, which I'm going to get to in a minute, this is a score of 26 to 29. Okay. And then, if you score this, there's a top score of 40. And so psychopaths score anywhere between 30 to 40. Okay. I believe Wayne Gacy scored a 37. Ted Bundy, I believe, scored a 34. And so you can kind of see Very few psychopaths will score clear up to a 40. I can't remember who it was that scored a 39, but it's very rare. They usually score between the lower 30s to mid 30 range. So that's kind of the score range that we would look at. Okay. So this is how psychopathology is assessed. And so now let's give some definition to psychopaths, and we can look at it from both a neurological and a developmental perspective. Okay, on the neurological level, we see what's called paralimbic system dysfunction. Okay, and what paralimbic dysfunction is let's imagine that this is our cortex. So this is a thing that's in our brain. It's what gives us our higher functioning. And then we have a limbic system underneath it, okay? The limbic system is often called the reptilian brain. It's also called the older part of the brain where the neocortex is the higher, okay? Our higher thinking functions occur in the frontal lobe of the cortex, okay? And so what we see in a normal context, and this is a normal context, is that let's say everybody's in the room has probably had someone that you just wanted to slap across the face or just hit, right? There's very few of us that probably would not meet that category at some point in our life. What happens is that initial response of aggression first goes to the limbic system. And then there's a couple seconds delay as that information is sent up to the the frontal cortex. And this is where we're ready to hit. We might even have our hands glitch. We might even be in a stance to be ready to do an aggressive act towards someone. But then we think, no, this would be a bad idea. It would get me in trouble. It would end up it would make things worse. Well, that's our frontal cortex taking over. And what happens at that moment is the frontal cortex sends what's called an inhibitory response to the limbic system. That message that the frontal cortex sends to the limbic system says, settle down, stop firing, we're not going to hit the person. What we find is this track system between the limbic system and the frontal cortical system tend to be missing in psychopaths. These things tend not to fire when we're measuring cortical response to aggressive situations. Okay, so there's a lack of connection between the frontal cortex and the limbic system. And this probably explains why many psychopaths tends to be very reactive and impulsive. And once they start an action, they're unable to stop it in some way. Okay. Now the question is this hereditary? Are we born with this, or is this something that happens due to development or experience? And the answer to that question is yes or no. Okay. We do find that people who have a family history of psychopathology, that does put them at a higher or a more probable risk of being psychopathic. So there is some genetic potentials to this disorder, or this condition, I should say. But we also know that there's lots of psychopaths that don't have this inhibitory response, where there is no type of family history or genetic markers that we can find. So the answer is, in some situations, yes, it's something that has to do with inheritance and genetics, but there's also this other area that can also cause this condition to trigger, okay? And this is when we look at a lot of developmental conditions, okay? Especially when we have these individuals that don't have this hereditary past. what we see is this lack, of course, this lack of theory of mind and a strong mentalizing system, but they also have very little attachment with their caregiver, okay? What we find with non-hereditary psychopaths is that they had a mother who absolutely didn't want them at all. They would do almost anything to abort the child, up to not getting actual and illegal abortion. They would hit themselves, they'd fall downstairs, they would do all kinds of things to abort it. And when the infant is born, they will completely shun it off. They will have nothing to do with it. Unfortunately, they tend not to adopt these infants out, and that continued treatment continues through that child's childhood, okay? And this creates severe attachment issues that we think then control this theory of mind progress, and then results in these organic issues that we see with the neurological or dysfunction with the paralimbic system, okay? So this is the person we're dealing with and that we're working with. There's definitely environmental influences. There can be genetic influences for some, but this is kind of the person we're dealing with, is a person who really doesn't see other peoples as completely humans, but they're objects to be consumed. So I want to differentiate, though, is psychopathology considered a mental illness? Well, let's look at some different types of disorders that are very similar to psychopathology. And we'll see that these disorders actually are considered mental illnesses, but psychopathology is not, because the criteria for a mental illness is that it has to cause some type of abnormal distress to the individual, okay? Psychopaths don't have any abnormal distress to who they are. They don't have any recognition that they even have a problem. It's not considered, it doesn't meet the clinical criteria to be defined as a mental illness. Now, there are similar disorders to what we see with psychopathology. And I want to kind of highlight these a little bit. First, we have conduct disorder, which is a diagnosis that is provided to children, usually above the age of 8, that tend to have acting out problems. They tend to, and when I say acting out, I'm not talking about mild bullying. I'm talking about young children who will destroy property, who will commit thievery, who will be violent towards other people. And this is kind of this condition that we give children. Now, most children with conduct disorders will actually end up with, as adults, being antisocial personality disorder, okay? Now, what is the difference between these individuals and psychopaths? Well, these are compounded disorders, because what we see is there's something called attachment disorder, which I'm going to represent with the A. Attachment disorder isn't to the level that psychopaths have, okay? Attachment disorder is when the attachment between the child and the caregiver doesn't occur in an appropriate manner. Either the child may be neglected, abused, but the parent is still involved. And attachment disorder is children between the age of about 2 to the age of 8. And these children tend to either be very aggressive or is the child who is constantly in what quote unquote timeout, as you would say, constantly being corrected. Attachment disorder is actually very treatable. I had a good friend who did attachment treatment, but and it's very correctable. That the issue is that treatment for attachment disorder is 90% the caregivers and only 10% the child, because the cause of that attachment, it has to do with the adults in the child's life, not necessarily the child. But as my friend explained, around the age of 8, no matter where they are in the attachment treatment, they stop attachment treatment. Because what we have found is that after the age of 8, there's nothing that's going to treat that attachment disorder. Okay, and meaning that the conduct of that child is going to become a lifelong struggle. Okay. And usually what we see is this then turns into conduct disorder. Okay. And during the conduct disorder phase, the child learns that the world doesn't care about them. They don't care about the world. They tend to become very extreme in their viewpoints. And they see the world as just this horrible place. And this then, around the age of 18, then leads to antisocial personality disorder, which I will label as AS. Okay. Now, why are these things considered non-psychopathic? It's because these individuals can actually engage in a intimate relationship. They can have caring relationships for other people. They don't see others as objects, but they see some people as threats. They see some people as people who are out to hurt them in some way. And so that's where their tendencies for crime comes from. These can be treated, but they can't be cured. All right. And I want to make that clear. Usually this is a lifelong type of treatment for these individuals. And so this is those, and remember, these are these individuals that scored between about a 26 to 30 on the Hare's psychopathic checklist. Okay. And then another one that often gets confused with psychopathology is narcissistic personality. And with a narcissist, everyone has a narcissist in their life, I think. I haven't come across someone who doesn't. This is an individual who has an extreme positive view of themselves. They're that person who, quote unquote, doesn't think their poop stinks, and that they think other people are below them. Okay. Why is this considered a disorder? While it is part of psychopathology, psychopaths tend to be very narcissistic. People with narcissistic personality can still make good moral decisions. And so they're probably the biggest a-holes in the office. They probably take advantage of other people and all of those things, but they know that they shouldn't steal, they shouldn't commit crimes, they shouldn't do those kinds of things. And that's kind of what differentiates these individuals from these individuals. Now, that's not to say that they can't. Many narcissists can get into relationship violence, but it's about the same rate as non-narcissistic people. Okay. So this is the situation that we have with these individuals. And then the last question that is often asked is, should we treat psychopathology? And so far, what we have found is that there's no treatment modality that really works. In fact, what we find is that treatment actually makes psychopaths worse. Because what are they doing when they're going through treatment? They're learning how to act emotional. So the therapist is sitting there saying, this is how most people react to this situation. And therefore the psychopath will go and practice it. They're not experiencing it. They're just learning how to use these techniques to become more manipulative. Okay. One of the things that I always encouraged domestic violence treatments to do is first do a psychopathic checklist on their group members, because especially in the group setting, not only does a psychopath become worse, they become more of a psychopath. In the group setting, they tend to make everyone else worse. And so That's an issue when the very first time I did offender treatment, there was a person who was defined as psychopath later on. And this individual tended to pick on the facilitators. And once he noticed that the facilitator's emotions got heightened, he would say, "Ha, see, I have control, you don't." Okay. And this person actually has the last name of me, last name as mine, and his eventual wife will be found in the bay in the Pacific Ocean in California. And so, yes, these individuals do exist. They have been sent to treatment and the treatment didn't work. So, okay, so this is where we're at with Psychopath so far. Does anybody have any questions so far? You can unmute yourself. You could put it in the chat. I just want to make sure we're clear on the person that we're dealing with. Okay. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead. Let me see what time it is. We're at 6:27. Let me see what we have going next. Okay, I think what we'll do is I'll get through this first part on the serial killer, but then I want to go through the profiling next Wednesday because there's some things that we need to talk about, such as organized versus disorganized and those kinds of things. But I want to real quickly make the connection between the serial killer and the psychopath. So for serial killers, we're going to use the FBI's definition, which is a person who kills in 3 or more separate events at 3 or more separate locations. So these are homicides that are occurring in 3 different time periods, and they're occurring in different locations. Okay, and between each homicide, there's something we call an emotional cooling period. Okay, and this is something that was learned in when I lived in actually Yuma. They had a serial rapist. Okay, and originally what they thought is that it was because most of the rapes occurred in the transit areas of Yuma by the railroad tracks and everything. So they thought that the incidences were very separate from each other, separate individuals and whatnot. But there was a rookie who went through his police training and did the classes and everything on this type of crime. And he talked the then what would it be, captain or chief, if he could take over the case, even though he was a rookie. And for some reason, the chief said yes. And he started looking at the crime scenes and everything else. Okay, and the MO of the individual is they would make it so the person was unconscious. They would do the act, and then the interesting thing though about the scenes is that there was the act, but then there were different locations in the room that he took these people in. Usually it was an abandoned building where there was footprints and scuffling, but there was also ejaculate that was younger than what was on the victim. Okay, so what this suggests is that the individual after that would then sit and they would touch themselves to what they just did. Okay, when you have this type of scene, this means that the individual is going to hold that act in their mind for a very long time. Okay, and this is what we mean by emotional cooling. When there's no post-mortem actions, usually the next homicide or the next, in this case, rape is going to happen very soon, because a person doesn't have that ability to keep that act in their mind very long. And once that initial act is out of their mind, then they go on to their next one in order to bring that back. But when there is post-mortem action afterwards, the person stays there for a longer period of time. That means they're going to be able to keep that act in their mind and play it over and over for a longer period of time. In this case, they guessed it at about 90 days, that the next time that the offender was going to be around was 90 days. And sure enough, with, I think it was on the 94th day, so a little bit off, they were doing, they did the kind of sting thing. They had extra officers within that area. And sure enough, they caught that offender and found out that he had been doing the previous crimes as well. So that is an example of what we mean by emotional cooling. It's really dependent upon how long the individual can re-fantasize about the act that they just did. Okay. Now, historically and across cultures, serial killings have actually been rare. Okay, you will notice that before about 1925 to 1944, the rates were fairly low. I mean, if you look at the bar graph, this increase is just completely statistically significant, as we would say. It just around 1925 and stuff, they just started shooting up and whatnot. And what can explain this? Well, if we think about what happened between the 1900s and 1925, we have this thing called industrialization and the Industrial Revolution. And what we think happened during this period of time is before the 1900s and stuff, people tended to be their own person, as you would say, meaning, if they were a farmer, they would farm their own food. It would be their land. They weren't working for someone else. And they tended to, they would produce their own product. They would sell that product and so on. Okay. And yeah, there were merchants selling to merchants, those kinds of things, but that was kind of, the person really didn't have what, quote unquote, a boss, as you would say. But during the Industrial Revolution, not only do you see people leaving from the rural areas, they're coming to the urban areas where those jobs are. They start having more free time because of the money and the pay, but they lose that sense of productivity. They lose that sense of self. They're now working for someone. They're responsible to someone for their own livelihood. Okay. And we think that break, putting people closer together, that loss of self determination is really what created this bump in increases in psychopathology. The other thing that we can note is that psychopathology and serial killing, I should say serial killing at this moment, serial killing is a uniquely Western phenomenon, okay? Because we don't see any cases of serial killing and psychopathology in other areas of the world until they've been Westernized, okay? That even includes Native Americans. We have yet to find one documented or one story of a Native American serial killer until Westernization of the United States and the Americas, okay? We don't see any cases of serial killings in the Eastern countries until they start to be colonialized by first England, but we don't even really see any serial killings in the Eastern countries until we start to get into the 20th and 21st centuries. And so we see that the serial killing and this notion of psychopathology is a uniquely Western phenomenon, okay? Now, we go back to Native Americans. That doesn't mean there wasn't violence between Native Americans and whatnot, but usually they weren't of a Western flavor. Remember what I said on Monday, most homicides in the United States are between family, friends, and intimate partners. And then you have serial killings, and that, like most of the violence that we saw among Native American groups, was intergroup violence, where one tribe would come in and attack another tribe and then commit atrocities against that other tribe. But very few times you saw violence within the tribal unit. There are some cases, there are some outliers. There's one on the East Coast, I can't remember the name of it, that tended to be pretty intra-group violence, but it wasn't of the same flavor as the Western type of violence that colonialized in the Americas. So I just wanted to bring those things into perspective from a sociological perspective. And we also see, okay, so if we look at non-psychopaths versus psychopaths, there's two kind of categories of homicide. Either people do it for an instrumental reason, okay, meaning that life insurance as an example, or for primary reactive crimes of passion in that moment, okay? When we look at non-psychopathic individuals, we will note that pretty much it's tied. Homicides occur both for primary, instrumental, or for reactive reasons. But when we look at the psychopath, the vast majority of serial killings is primarily for instrumental reasons, meaning that the psychopath gets something out of it. Very few homicides for psychopaths are a moment of reactive passion, as in the example. Okay, usually they do it for a very instrumental reason, to gratify some need or to curiosity, and that in some cases. But this is kind of what we're working with. Okay. So I think I'm going to stop here, gang, because in order to do our exercise with profiling, that's the word I keep looking for, we need to understand the typologies of serial killers and the types of serial killers there are. So I'm actually going to, I want to leave this for Wednesday because I want to make sure that we have this information all in once. So I'm going to end our recording right here. And I'm just going to ask, does anybody have any questions so far in this conversation that we're having about these unique individuals in our world? Y'all got quiet on this one.
No questions, Professor.
Okay, thank you, Savannah. None. Okay. All right. All right, gang. Let's go ahead and get out of here for tonight, and then we'll continue this with typologies and thanks, Jeremy, for that feedback. We'll look at typologies and get into profiling this coming Wednesday. Remember, for those who joined after the initial announcements, Monday is a working class to give you time to do your quiz, which has been posted on Canvas. So with that being said, have a very good night. Take care, everyone, and we will see you next Wednesday.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.